Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we'll be talking about how communication biases are impacting your organization, and joining us to contribute to the conversation is Heather Hansen. Welcome, Heather.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me, Jana. This is really fun to be here.
Very glad to have you. Do you want to share a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, I am a global communication specialist. So basically, what I do is I work with top leaders who are usually managing multicultural, multinational, multilingual teams and helping them to really balance for inclusion in those teams, making sure that all voices are heard, that those who may be less confident are speaking up and sharing their ideas, that we're getting the best out of our people from a communication perspective. And my background is I am originally from California, but I left the US almost exactly 20 years ago. It was 20 years ago in July. And the last 20 years, I've split between Denmark. My husband's Danish, so we lived there 8 years, and we've been in Singapore, where I'm based now, for 12. My company is based here. My kids are born here. And Singapore is really our home. And it's an amazing place to be because it is so international and multicultural and multilingual. And so every meeting I walk into has 5, 6, 7 nationalities and double that in the number of languages. And we have to navigate a lot of challenges around how we communicate and use English as a lingua franca, both from a native speaker perspective, or the white Western English speaker, versus the rest of the world, which also encompasses many native speakers, but we forget that. And that type of language isn't given the same respect. So I'm sure we'll be diving into those topics a lot more today. But that's the overview of what I'm doing.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, well, let's start like level setting and talk about what does it mean to have a communication bias? Like, what do we even mean by that?
Well, it's even more specific than communication, I would say, although we could look at it a few different ways. I tend to call this more of a linguistic bias, although it could stretch to more than just language. What it really refers to is the fact that when we're participating in conversations, we are biased to listen to and respect people who actually sound and communicate in a way that is more like ourselves. So a lot of people will say, "Oh, no, I don't have an accent." A lot of people who sound like me will say, "I don't have an accent," but yeah, everybody does. Everyone has an accent. And the way that we grow up, we develop biases around accents that are part of our in-group, ones that we can trust, ones that we respect. And then we have other ideas about other accents. And this could be within the same country and the same language. I mean, looking at the United States, we have immediate ideas about a person when they open their mouth, and we can hear they're from the southern states, or they're from Boston, or they're from New Jersey or New York or Brooklyn, or you just already have an idea of what those people are like. And also villains in movies. When I grew up on Indiana Jones and Die Hard and all those bad guys, they were all German or Russian. And then we moved out of the Cold War, and then they became Arab, or, depending on the geopolitical landscape, those biases change. We can look at The Simpsons and Apu, the Indian shopkeeper, who was actually voiced by a white man, making up what he thought was a funny Indian accent, and how that permeated our entire society and our bias toward that accent. So looking at the micro situation of the actual language being used and how it is used, we have biases there, but it extends to a larger level of communication, as you were saying, because it also has to do with how we use our body language, how much we smile, the visual stimuli we give one another. And that can also be affected by a lot of cultural markers too. So this is a very big topic, and we can look at it from a number of different dimensions, but I'm just happy that we're starting to talk about this. It's something that's overlooked quite often.
Yeah, and when you talk about the body language, and there's a level of, there was a study done, and it actually, it was a conference I attended in Singapore that I heard this at, and it was 10 nine years ago or something, but it was talking about how like openness kind of and transparency and some of those measures, saying like, when you talk about Germans, there's a lot more rigidity to them. They're more structured in their communication. They say what they mean, versus with maybe Japanese, there's a lot more nuance to how they talk. There's subtle messages that aren't always given verbally. And so they aren't always saying what they mean, at least not in their like actual words being
More
used.
indirectly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
And so I guess let's start it, because that's a really high level that's driven, like,
Hmm.
because that can be really difficult, because you get somebody like
Hmm.
me who just says things where it is, like it is, and I can offend people
Hmm.
because some people don't want to be told that bluntly. So can we talk maybe starting at that level, and maybe we'll work our way down
Yeah,
there.
sure, 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 sure. Well, first starting with this idea of kind of national culture, because that's a concept that I don't necessarily agree with. I think it's so much more unique, right? We can use that as sort of a generalized stereotype, but especially in global business and in places like Singapore or Dubai or these really international cities, you're meeting people who have been all over the world, have all different influences. And so, I mean, if you were to come to me and treat me the way you think an American wants to be treated. Well, I haven't lived in America for 20 years, and I've lived in cultures that are so hugely different from, what we might think of as some American standard. And what is that exactly? Because our states are so different, California to Texas to Florida to New York. I mean, our state cultures, and then smaller the cities and smaller the neighborhoods and smaller the families. So when you get down to that level, you realize that culture is very unique to the individual, and it has, all of us have a different perspective and life experiences, right?
But
But
I guess let's
there is a
pause there.
starting point
Yeah,
there.
let's, because I do agree, because like you can say the same with men and women, right? Like there are some
Right.
that
Yeah.
women generally do, but it's a spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but I think using United States though is probably the most difficult one probably to use, in the sense that it collects the most diversity in ethnicity and culture, in that, there is no other country, as far as what I've researched, that has as much diversity as the United States does when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
the mingling of cultures and things. So I
Yeah.
guess if you take that out of it, do you see some trends? I mean, granted, everything is a spectrum, and you can't bucket
Mm-hmm.
anybody
Mm-hmm.
into one group, but do you see more alignment outside of the United States at all? Or is it just as
Well, I'm not
diverse?
sure. If we look at from a linguistic perspective and the way languages are used in things, I'm always shocked and amazed by how such small areas can have such diversity in language. So, for example, in Denmark, you can drive across the whole country in, I don't know, maybe 7 hours from the airport in Copenhagen all the way up to the northernmost tip, 7 or 8 hours max. And there are very distinct ways of speaking, accents,
Hmm.
almost dialects. The southern peninsula that borders Germany, we almost can't understand them when they speak Danish. And then versus the high Danish of the Royal Danish of
Right.
Copenhagen, very different from the middle of the country where I lived. Or if you look at a place like Switzerland, they're German. Just in the German section of Switzerland, they speak completely different dialects of German. And it
Hmm.
is the smallest space. So
Hmm.
culture is just so it changes so easily, and language, those lines are drawn in much smaller areas than you can imagine. And we're used to the United States where it's huge and we see these differences, and it's like, well, that's understandable that we're going to be different in New York from California. We're so far away from each other. That's like Denmark to Spain. but but to see it within these small European countries, and even within Singapore, we have four official languages:
Mhm.
English, Malay, Tamil, and Mandarin. And we have the three main cultures, Chinese, Malay, and Indian. And then we have this huge mix of an expat population that's almost 20% of the population. I mean, it's huge. And so it's just so international. So it's hard to group that. But I mean, going back to the original question around, are there some basic generalizations we make? Of course, there are. We talk about, the East being much more indirect in the communication than the West, much more circular in their communication style than the directness of maybe Western Europe or Americans, North Americans. So there are some grand sweeping generalizations we can and do make that are good to have in the back of your mind when you're entering these global conversations, but just to remember that someone could surprise you. I'll have a client come to me and I look at the brief and it's like, okay, Japanese and la la la. And I have this idea in my mind of what they're going to be. And then I get on the phone and they sound as American as me because they did their entire undergrad and worked there 10 years and then moved back to Asia. And I'm going, oh, wow. And they act like me, they sound like me. And so those assumptions we make can just be very far off when we're maybe preparing for a negotiation or a sales call or walking into a meeting. And so we have to be careful. Our world is incredibly global now
Yeah.
and very, very mixed.
So what do you think? Maybe share some missteps that can happen then based on not understanding how the different communication styles work, like how somebody who maybe is more like say it how it is might misunderstand somebody who is more nuanced. What are some of those
Yeah.
challenges that you see?
Well, a lot of the leaders that I work with tend to be much more direct. And even within, and I mean, even Singaporean director level leaders that I work with can be very direct. The people that they're working with may not be so direct. And so these individuals can come across as quite aggressive or bossy in that sense, not listening, not taking into consideration other views or opinions or ideas. And using another generalization that in the Asian context, which of course that's also, I mean, Asia is a million different things, but overall, we know that there's a certain level of respect and hierarchy that's respected. So a team member may not speak up against that boss or say, actually, I don't know if I agree with that, or they may not feel comfortable to do that, maybe because of the age difference or the power distance or whatever it might be. So a lot of these problems seep in really, really easily in our team communications because we're just sort of talking over each other in that sense. So, I mean, stepping away from where people are from or what's happening, that directness can very much be seen as aggression in a lot of situations if we aren't careful about it. But I think some of the bigger issues I see as well are expecting or thinking that just because someone is quiet in the meeting that they don't have something to say or they aren't contributing, they don't have a contribution. And often that's not the case. There could be just confidence issues with the language. There could be a cultural dynamic in the team where they feel unsafe, psychologically unsafe. If I say anything, they're just going to shoot me down anyway. Or it could be an accent issue where they're just not comfortable or confident that people will understand them. And so they hold back, or they just need a little bit more time to jump in, but the conversation's moved on too quickly. So there are lots of things happening, but I would say we need to really pay attention to those people who are quieter, to invite them into the conversation, give them space to think and to speak up when they're ready. And that's important as well.
And there, I mean, I guess when you think about the dynamics of communication in general, like, we do a lot of project calls and, there's a lot going on when people are talking, like, especially if you've got challenges, right? Because then you've got other things like, pride or self-worth, like justifying your self-worth, that I just think about how people feel like they have to always get in the word edge, that phrase, get a word in edgewise or whatever, and they really drive their point, and they even sometimes interrupting is seems to be permitted in certain types of conversations, right? Because you want to make sure, like, that you start before the other person finishes so that you get to make your point. I hear that a lot on different client calls, so team calls. So I guess that really puts certain people at a disadvantage, though, is where I
It
guess I put it with
definitely,
that.
it definitely
And so
does.
I guess on both sides, one, how do you create space for those people? But then two, what's your advice for those people, to take
Mhm.
some ownership, I guess, of it?
Yeah. Well, probably the easiest way to explain it is is from my most recent book, Unmuted. And I developed the Unmuted framework, where if you think of a Venn diagram, conscious, confident, and connected communication. So you need those three pieces to be fully unmuted, feel like that you can speak up and you can voice your views. And what we see happening, or what I have seen, and what this framework is based on, is what I've seen in organizations where maybe some people are very confident and feel very connected, have good relationships. Their voices, that crossover ends up being a bit too loud. So their voices are too loud, they're dominating. They're missing that conscious piece. They're missing the listening skills, the cross-cultural intelligence. They're missing the understanding of how to accommodate their language to others at different levels. And so when you're lacking that conscious element, your voice becomes too loud. Now, at the same time, we have people who are very conscious and connected. They're in very supportive places. And yet, for some reason, they're lacking the confidence, self-confidence or skills confidence to press unmute and speak up. And really, they're the only ones that can change that, because they're in a very caring environment. They have high conscious levels. They're good listeners. They're good communicators, but they're lacking that self-worth to think that what I have to say is important and I should speak up. And those people really do need to be invited in. That's all it takes is, oh, Alex, did you have something to say? You haven't really spoken up yet today. You must be thinking something. And then, oh, well, actually, and of course they have something to say. And then the final group that we have is probably the saddest one. Those are ones who are very conscious and confident, but they don't feel a connection to the group. They don't feel psychologically safe. They don't have good relationships in the company. They're in a toxic environment, and therefore they're on mute completely. They've just given up. They're disengaged, and they're saying, you know what, I'm not even going to speak because I know that you're not going to listen to me. You're not going to take anything I say into consideration. So I'll just be quiet. And these are the people we end up losing in the organization. And that's probably the biggest waste of talent that we can see. And that's what we see with toxic management, toxic environments. So looking from all of those perspectives, of course, if you have a voice that's a bit too loud, you want to try to turn down your voice a little bit, give more space, invite others in, be more aware of the energy of the room, who's spoken, who hasn't. If you're one of those who's too soft, turn up that voice, make an effort. You're the only one that can press that unmute button. Other people can't do it for you. So it's not a one-way street where, oh, these dominant, talkative people are ruining everything. No, some responsibility is also on the other to step into the conversation, right? And then our people who are on mute, that's just about creating positive environments where people do have that psychological safety to participate.
And are there some, I guess, symptoms that you see then of where those environments may, be toxic or may be uninviting, that you can share with people, like warning signs to be looking for?
I would say if you ever hear the phrase, but that's just not how we do it here. that's usually a sign of a stagnant workplace that isn't very curious, where the leadership is not open to new ideas. I think that's a very toxic signal of, well, that's just not how we do it here. Not open to change, especially in our day and age where everything is moving and changing so quickly. We really do need to be open to new discussions and new ideas and new innovations. And if we're saying that's just not how it's done here, then we aren't open to hearing those new ideas, and people will stop voicing them. They'll start pressing mute and saying, okay, forget it. You don't want to hear anything. Anything I bring to the table, you dismiss. You want to keep everything the same as it's always been. And I'm getting bored. I'm going to go find a new position somewhere else and take my talents that you're wasting somewhere else. So I think that's a really big sign. Also, leaders who are constantly interrupting or not allowing people to voice full opinions, or not being able to take feedback, or very defensive. So this is something that I think really starts at the top and then trickles down. If the leadership isn't on board wanting to have more innovation and inclusion, it's not going to happen. It has to start there. So it's about leaders really stopping to take a look at themselves, to analyze their own biases. Where are they maybe not being as inclusive as they could? How can they better include everyone at the table and everyone's ideas? And how can they be open to that feedback and be very curious about others and how they can work together to move the organization forward?
It's really good. So I'm curious, maybe if we go down a layer into actual language itself,
Mhm.
um, because as we're more international companies, you do have people where maybe the company language is English, but English is a second language to folks. Um,
Mhm.
and as we've talked about how everybody's different, everybody has different linguistic, I guess, skills and maybe like their ear training and things. So it
Mhm.
can be very frustrating. Accents can be very frustrating, depending on your comfort with being able to hear and interpret what's being
Mhm.
said. So
Mhm.
talk to me a little bit about how you help organizations navigate that, or individuals navigate, some of that.
Mhm. Well, we've there's a lot of research around linguistic bias, linguistic imperialism, globalization, and language that's been carried out over the last 3 decades, 4 decades. And very recently, some interesting studies coming out of the UK, a group called Accent Bias Britain that is working to really dig into how accent bias is playing out in the workplace. What are the attitudes? And they're looking primarily, of course, at different British varieties and accents, because it's amazing what we were saying earlier, just in the UK, the number of different dialects. And we don't even really recognize all those differences, and they don't have the same loaded meaning for us outside of the UK as people who grow up there and they hear these different accents. They immediately identify where those people are from, if they're working class or higher educated, their social status, everything. And so that's been some very, very interesting research around what's happening in the workplace. And it can be very frustrating. And usually, if you are getting frustrated by a certain accent, that's when you know there's some kind of bias at play, if that's a frustration for you. Because think about just the differences, and I'm going to go very stereotypically here. Indian English accent. It's one that I hear across the board. People are very frustrated when they listen to Indian English.
Mm,
For an American from an American perspective,
mm,
why might that be? Well, most of us, whenever we have had contact with an Indian accent, it has been calling a call center where we were already having difficulty and trouble with something. We were already frustrated going into that conversation. Then we're struggling to understand the person. We're frustrated that why can't I speak to someone who sounds like me? This person doesn't know anything. They don't have any education. They're never going to figure this out. And we have this really negative experience, and that gets embedded in us. And then what happens down the line when we hear that accent again? It's this immediate frustration that comes back. So if you are having that frustration, there's probably a trigger there and a reason why, and a bias that you're carrying. Now let's think of speaking to someone with an Italian accent or a French accent, and do we have the same frustration, or are we like, oh, I love your accent, it's just so beautiful to listen to, that's just so pretty, oh, where are you from? We have very different reactions and responses and levels of patience depending on our personal biases toward a certain accent. And maybe I love the Italian and the French, and somebody else is like, oh, I hate a French accent. It all depends on the experiences they've had in their lives,
mm.
and the contact that they've had with different people and different countries and cultures. And then we create stories around all these things and stereotypes and categorize people. And that then plays out in the workplace when we then have a colleague that we have to speak to on a conference call. And, oh, they're just so hard to understand. I hate listening to that accent. Oh, it just drives me crazy. And we choose, consciously or subconsciously, to just turn off. We're no longer listening. We
Mm.
aren't giving them any credit for what they say. We aren't respecting what they say. We won't listen, and we won't take their ideas seriously, because of actually a bias that's underneath. And that's what can get really scary in global workplaces, when we aren't really listening to people when they speak up, simply because they sound a certain way that for some reason triggers us due to our own life experiences. And that's scary when that starts to happen.
What are some other ways that you see these accent biases or communication biases come into the workplace, other than, you mentioned listening? Do you see it in
Mhm.
interviews or
Yes.
um,
Yep. Hiring decisions, promotion decisions, And there's research to support it, that hiring decisions can be affected by accent bias. Now, the good news is the most recent studies coming out are showing that simply by raising the awareness of the interviewer that accent bias exists, simply by having a small statement at the top of the interview form and saying, studies have shown that accent bias can impact the results of a hiring interview. Please be aware, or please disregard anything that isn't directly related to the subject at hand. And just a simple statement like that can make a difference in eliminating that bias in the hiring discussion. Later on down the line, when we're looking at promotion, this is an area I would really like to see studied a bit more, because I will get clients, I'm working with this real high level of individuals who are moving from a director role into C-suite, for example, and they'll call me and say, we aren't sure if we can move this person into C-suite. We aren't sure if they can really represent the company, and their communication skills, we just aren't sure. They aren't very clear and people have trouble understanding them. I'm not sure that they can represent us on a global stage. They aren't as global as we'd like. And these are all very subjective terms. What does it mean to sound or act global? What's wrong with being and sounding Singaporean, for example? Why is that a hindrance? You're telling me this person who's been in the company 20 years and has worked their way all the way up, and you've put through all of the high potential management programs and you've invested so much, and you're telling me because you don't like the way they speak or their presentation style that's the reason you won't promote them. And that, to me, just doesn't seem fair, that something like that can hold them back.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because I can see it both ways. You're right. In some ways, it's very subjective, and if it's just a matter of it rubs me the wrong way or whatever, well, that's not fair, and they're competent and they have all the other skills. But what about somebody who has a hard time, like, English, maybe it is a very English speaking organization and we're high up. And so you're having to have really clear and concise communication where you're giving a strategy or you're giving a vision and how to execute against that vision. And if people don't understand you because you can't articulate those ideas in the language they're listening to it, I mean, that could be a hindrance, couldn't it?
It could be. You have to have a basic level of intelligibility. People need to be able to understand you. In my experience, people at that level of the organization speak English just fine. English isn't the issue, right? They couldn't have made it to that level in a global organization without it. So that typically is not the problem, right? It is more of there is a bias at play there, where we're afraid to send him to speak to the board of directors in America. We're afraid that he won't be able to impress them. We're playing into this sort of Western ideal of, well, global business, this is how it works. And it is very much dominated by the Western expats. And I just recently read a report from, I believe it's something called Asia CEO Forum, and they had done a survey of their membership back in 2017. So it may have changed since. But at that time, 80% of their membership, which are all C-suite, 80% were non-Asian. And this is the Asia CEO Forum. And that makes you stop and wonder, what's going on? Why is the Western world still dominating global business to such a high degree? And, Singapore, less than 60 years old, they've made their mark on the map. Their universities are some of the top universities in the world. I think the most recent rankings, they're like number 19 and 36 globally, up there with, the Harvards, MITs, Oxfords, Cambridge. Why is it that we aren't seeing more Singaporean CEOs or C-suite professionals? What is it exactly that's holding them back? And so that's why when they get sent to me, and I obviously have a very narrow view of this, so everything I see is through this communication lens, because those are the people who come to me. But the fact that that's one of the factors that's keeping them from being promoted is a pretty important thing for us to look at. Yeah.
And so what has your conclusion come to with the people that you've seen?
Yeah, it's difficult because this is the hypocrisy of my entire career. First of all, that I've come out to Asia. I built a company from a relatively very young age, walking into C-suite offices and having people say, yes, please coach me. I had never held a corporate job. There's no local Singaporean who could have built what I've built here in the last 15 years. Not
Mm.
possible. So I know for a fact that my privilege, both as a white person, also as a native English speaker with an accent that is seen as prestigious in this part of the world, that has been an enormous privilege for me. So that is one side of this equation. And then people come to me saying, I need to change the way I speak so I can fit into this ideal. I want to sound like you. I want to be eloquent. I want to sound, really, I want to sound Western. I want to sound global, which equals Western. And I'm saying, well, you shouldn't need to. You shouldn't need to do that. And yet I know if we don't do something, they will not get that promotion and they will not be allowed to represent the company at the higher levels. So it's this constant battle I personally face in trying to help people get to that next level and play into the biases and the discrimination of our global economy, even though at the same time I'm trying to present this message to the rest of the world to say, hey, maybe it's time for us to start listening a little bit more and to open up our minds and tune our ears to other accents and ways of speaking, because it's just as valid, right? As Singaporeans in particular, they grow up with the language. They speak it. Indians speak the language from birth. They're speaking English in school. Filipinas, Nigerians, they actually are native speakers, but we don't recognize them as such.
Yeah, there's I guess a couple of thoughts I had, when you're saying that, because there, like, you take it to there's the study out of Texas about attractive people get paid something like 27% more than unattractive. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, yeah, the definition of attractive changes over time, right? You get, like, used to be 200 years ago, if you were heavy, overweight, that was a good thing because it showed prosperity.
Yeah.
Now, if you're thin, it means you get to spend in the gym, be in the gym all the time. So that must mean prosperity. So all of that changes, but the fact that we're attracted to people who are attractive is subconscious. And even if we can influence, I still kind of wonder how much you can totally take it out. You know what I mean? Even if you're
You
active.
can't. You
Yeah.
can't.
And
You
then the
can't.
other piece that comes to mind is just that, there's been some discussions around just this concept of, like, tribe, right? Where if you take it way back, the reason we have biases to people who look like us or sound like us is because we know that was our tribe and there's psychological safety. And then we've started to train ourselves of, oh, I can't just automatically react when I see a person of a different color that's scary. But there's probably still some of that underlying, like, just instinct, right? That you can train to extent, but I guess it's the instinct's always there, even if you've kind of trained it out, or trained minimal.
And when it comes to language, it's really amazing because we know that when you are in the womb, you're already listening to the mother, right? You can hear the patternings of the speech. So when you're born, you already can recognize your soon to be native language because you know what it sounds like, the patterning of that. When I lived in Denmark, it's funny when I tell this story because anytime I saw a newborn or a young child, young baby, and before I could speak Danish, I'd go up, oh, you're so cute, and oh, are you sweet? And the baby would just go, wah! Like scream, and every baby hated me. It's like, what's wrong with me? All the Danish babies hate me. And it's because they could already hear and understand that I was foreign. I was different. I wasn't safe. I'm not their mom. And I sounded different. I mean, even my little niece, she hated me. It was like, we are hardwired. We're hardwired. That's part of our survival to know and understand and hear the differences. Way back in the tribal days, we knew if someone else was from our tribe by the way they spoke, the way they sounded, and that has stuck with us. That's why we have this, and it is a survival tactic. It's a way of knowing us versus them and surviving. But somehow we need to eventually move away from it. But the good news is we know that by just being aware that this exists is already a massive step one of these studies as well out of the Accent Bias Britain project. They were looking at all these different typical diversity and inclusion kind of unconscious bias training programs and what different kinds of interventions would really make a difference. The only one that made a significant difference was simply raising awareness that accent bias exists. Everything else, there was no significant change, but simply making someone aware that it existed, then they suddenly were thinking, oh, wow, am I being biased? Am I giving this person a chance? I didn't even realize that existed. And many of us don't realize it exists and that it's something that's affecting us. And it's missing from pretty much all DEI programs, this concept of language and accent, which is built in. We talk a lot about inclusive language. Don't say you guys, because that's, disrespectful to women, or don't, and using our pronouns and those things. That's one thing, inclusive language. But are you being inclusive about language and accent in general? It's underlying all of these programs around diversity and inclusion. And if you aren't paying attention to that, then you're missing a huge, huge piece of the puzzle, because that underlies everything.
No, it's interesting that has such an impact. And I'd be curious then, so that no other things that they've seen that you can kind of do to help yourself at the moment.
Well, they all help. They all help, all the different interventions, putting them through a short online training and doing this and doing, raising awareness and tuning your ear to new accents. All of these things help. They all help. But the only significant difference they saw was making people aware. And of course, that's going to be the first step in order to run any of the other interventions. So I think that's also why that there's such a significant step up, just being made aware that it exists and going, whoa, having that aha moment. Then the rest is just building on it. And so definitely, I run programs around overcoming accent bias. And so it starts by first raising that awareness, making people understand that we have it, where it comes from, why we have it, then really taking a hard look at what are our individual biases, because we all have different ones, depending on where we grew up, the movies we watched, the shows we loved, our teachers, our parents, all of those things. Then starting to look at it in the organizational context, sharing stories around, have people in the office ever felt that way? Or have you experienced accent bias in your native language or foreign language? Because it happens in both, and it happens in every language. This is not an English thing. It's in every language.
How the French won't let you speak their language if you can't get it right.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, even look at Canadian French versus Parisian French, right? And there's a lot of back and forth there, or any foreigner who tries to speak French. Yeah.
I know. They'll be like, no, I'll just speak English. Thank you.
Yeah. And even things like mainland China's Mandarin and varieties, and they can hear what Singapore Mandarin, that it's very different. Just like an American will listen to Singapore English and think, oh, that's weird. Why do they talk like that? And Chinese from China will think the same of a Singaporean Mandarin speaker. So this is happening everywhere in every language. So it's about, digging into those stories, sharing those stories in the workplace, understanding what microaggressions are linked to language. Things like, oh, and I got this all the time in Denmark. Oh, your accent's so charming. We're in the middle of a business meeting. Like, really? Do you think I'm trying to be charming? You would never, ever say that to me if I was speaking English right now, because I am everything but charming in a business meeting in English. So when you hear that over and over again, it's a constant reminder that you are other, that you do not belong, that you're not a part of that group, that no matter what you do, how hard you try, how fluent you are, you're still foreign, you still are not listened to the same way. So identifying what microaggressions could be triggering for people and are actually quite disrespectful, even though the person saying it is trying to give a compliment and just, oh, I love your accent, but there's appropriate places, to talk about those things. And then the final piece of the puzzle that we do is we look at how to tune our ears to different accents, because a lot of times it just has to do with more contact. So that accent that you say, oh, they're so hard to understand. Oh, I'm so frustrated. It's so hard. It takes too much effort. I don't want to listen. I'm on a late night call with this other country, and the last thing I want to do is have to, try to translate their English. And that's a very real frustration, but you can work on that. You can start looking at it as a game of cracking a code, because you know that whatever sounds they make will be consistent. That TH will always be a D or a T or an F, perhaps. Once you understand the language they're coming from, you will know exactly what changes they're going to make in their accent. And if you have a better idea and understanding of that, it's almost a game of, oh yeah, I do understand this. And of course I do. We actually understand much, much more than we think. And there have been studies that showed that as well. Dictation, they write every single word, pass the paper back and say, I didn't understand a thing. That person's so hard to understand. It's like, well, you just wrote down every word they said. So that's also very subjective when we say it's too hard to understand. We might be tired. We don't want to make the
Yeah, it's
effort.
our
Yeah.
patience. Yeah.
Yeah, our
Well,
patience. So there is a lot that we can do to take those steps forward in our teams, with the right training and awareness and working and effort, working towards it.
yeah. No, those are some interesting tips as well. So the time's flown by actually.
It really has. Oh my gosh.
So I'd love to hear what are like the top 3 things you want to leave top of mind for people.
I think for those of us who are very confident in the English language, and especially those of us who were lucky enough to be born into accents that seem accentless, that are very much accepted and prestigious, we need to really remember to turn down our voices at times, to give space for others, to invite others into the conversation, to be more inclusive, and to make sure all the voices are heard. For the people who are struggling and feel like maybe, oh, my language isn't good enough, or they aren't going to like what I have to say, or my ideas aren't good enough. It's about turning up that voice and really becoming a part of the conversation. And then I would say for anyone in the leadership roles and leadership positions, you really need to be looking at all of this from a bird's eye view to make sure that you're balancing your teams and that everyone does feel included. And that's your job, to go in and make sure that those quieter voices are heard and that they are speaking up and they're prepared to speak in that meeting and they know that their voice is valued. Because especially today, I think everyone wants to contribute and they want to feel acknowledged for their contribution. So I would say those are the 3 kind of core concepts I would want to leave with everyone when it comes to their global, multinational, multilingual, multicultural communication.
Well, that's great. Thanks so much, Heather. How can folks get in contact with you or get a hold of your book? What's best?
You can learn all about the book and my speaking and coaching at heatherhansen.com. The training firm that I run out of Singapore, Global Speech Academy.com, is where we run our training programs. And of course, I love meeting everyone on LinkedIn and following along and starting discussions there. And I do post a lot there on accent bias and global communication. So I'd love to hear from anyone who's interested.
Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Well, thank you. This has been really fun. I know we could have talked all day, I think. So thanks a lot for having me and giving me a platform to share.
Yeah, and then and to our audience, until next time, keep your organizations healthy.
Hey! It's your tomorrow.